The summer of 1914 in Australia was bright and full of promise. Archie Barwick was just 24 years old, a farm boy from New South Wales, when the news swept across the country like wildfire. Britain was at war, and so was Australia. Crowds gathered in Sydney and Melbourne, cheering with wild enthusiasm, waving Union Jacks and singing patriotic songs. Young men thronged the recruiting stations, eager to prove themselves. Archie was among them. Tall, wiry, and full of restless energy, he felt the pull of adventure as much as duty. Like many in his generation, he had grown up on tales of empire and honor, of gallant soldiers marching off to fight for king and country. The idea that he could be part of such history was irresistible. I joined because it seemed the thing to do. He would later write in his diary, "All my mates were going. I thought it would be a fine chance to see the world." The Army gave him a uniform, a rifle, and a new identity. Private Archie Barwick of the 1st Battalion, Australian Imperial Force. Training was tough but brief, held in dusty camps under the hot Australian sun. The men drilled, marched, and learned the basics of soldiering. Many were raw recruits, farmhands, clerks, miners, who had never held a rifle before. But there was an air of excitement in the camps, a sense that they were part of something grand and noble. In October 1914, Archie and thousands of others boarded troopships bound for Egypt. Crowds lined the harbors, waving handkerchiefs and cheering. Bands played "God Save the King." Mothers wept, sweethearts blew kisses, and fathers stood proud, their chins lifted high. The ships steamed out of Sydney Harbor, their decks crowded with young men shouting and singing, not knowing if they would ever see home again. The voyage to Egypt was long but filled with anticipation. Archie spent his days drilling on deck, cleaning his rifle, writing letters home, and swapping stories with his mates. He wrote often in his diary, describing the daily routine, the camaraderie, and the excitement of seeing the wide ocean and faraway ports. When the ships finally reached Egypt, the men were stunned by the sights and sounds of Cairo. The ancient pyramids rose out of the desert, camels and donkeys crowded the streets, and the bazaars overflowed with spices, fabrics, and strange trinkets. Archie marveled at it all, scribbling in his diary about a land that seems out of the Bible itself. But there was little time for sightseeing. The Australians trained hard in the desert sands, preparing for a campaign, the details of which were still secret. Rumors spread that they would fight in Turkey, at a place called the Dardanelles. Few knew where that was, but the thought of battle thrilled them. "We'll give the Turks a hiding," Archie wrote confidently. "They won't know what's hit them." On the night of April 24, 1915, Archie boarded a transport ship in Alexandria. The men were silent now, their earlier laughter subdued. They knew that battle was ahead, though they did not yet know how fierce it would be. The ships sailed north across the Mediterranean, carrying the Australians and New Zealanders toward a small peninsula jutting into the Sea Gallipoli. The landing came at dawn on April 25. Archie and his mates were crammed into small boats, pulled toward the shore by naval launches. The sea was calm, but the air crackled with tension. Suddenly, as the boats neared the beach, rifle fire tore through the stillness. Bullets whipped the water, shells exploded overhead, and men cried out in pain. Archie flung himself into the surf, water rushing into his boots. Around him, men splashed and stumbled, some sinking beneath the waves. The beach ahead was a chaos of sand, wire, and gunfire. The cliffs loomed steep and forbidding, Turkish soldiers firing down from above. Archie ran, his rifle clutched tight, the sand kicking up around his feet as bullets struck all around. "It was like hell itself," he wrote later. The noise was deafening, the air thick with smoke and dust. Men fell left and right. I thought I would never reach the scrub at the base of the cliffs, but somehow I did, panting and shaking, my heart hammering like a drum. The first days at Gallipoli were a blur of terror and exhaustion. The Australians clawed their way up the cliffs, digging trenches wherever they could, fighting hand to hand against the Turks. The ground was rocky and unforgiving, the heat by day scorching, the nights bitterly cold. Flies swarmed over everything, crawling into food, wounds, and mouths. Archie wrote in his diary with brutal honesty. He described the stench of death that hung over the trenches, the moans of the wounded, the constant sniping that made every movement dangerous. He spoke of comrades killed beside him, men he had joked with only hours before. Yet he also wrote of the courage and mateship that bound the soldiers together. They shared water, rations, and cigarettes, comforted one another in the dark, and lifted their spirits with jokes and songs. "It's the mates that keep you going," Archie noted. "Without them, a man would go mad." As the weeks dragged into months, the campaign bogged down into stalemate. The Australians and Turks faced each other across narrow strips of no man's land, firing, bombing, and digging endlessly. The conditions grew worse. Water was scarce, food was monotonous, disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery laid men low, leaving them weak and gaunt. Flies feasted on unburied corpses. Archie endured it all, his diary becoming both an outlet and a testament. He recorded not only the horrors but also the small triumphs, a letter from home, a successful raid, a sunrise that turned the sea gold. "Gallipoli is hell," he wrote, "but it is also a place where men show what they are truly made of." By the end of 1915, the campaign had failed. The Allies evacuated in secret, slipping away under cover of night. Archie was among the last to leave, stepping onto a boat with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He had survived, but at a terrible cost. Thousands of his countrymen had been killed, wounded, or buried in that narrow strip of foreign soil. Gallipoli would haunt him forever. Archie Barwick soon learned that Gallipoli was not a place of glory, but of endless suffering. The landing had been only the beginning. What followed was months of grinding misery in trenches carved into the steep, rocky slopes above the Aegean Sea. The Australians dug furiously, day and night, with picks and shovels, carving out dugouts barely large enough for a man to lie down in. The earth was hard and dry, littered with stones that tore their hands and blunted tools. The trenches twisted in jagged lines across the ridges, connected by narrow communication saps that became death traps when snipers spotted movement. Archie described it all in his diary with a mix of disbelief and grim acceptance. "The Turks are only a few yards away," he wrote. "You can hear them talking at night. Sometimes they shout insults in broken English. Other times they lob bombs into our trenches. We return the favor. It is a strange sort of war. Part battle, part siege, part waiting game. Life in the trenches was filthy beyond imagining." The men were plagued by lice, fleas, and swarms of flies that seemed to coat every surface. Dead bodies lay half, buried in shallow graves, their stench drifting on the hot wind. Dysentery and typhoid spread like wildfire, leaving men weak and dehydrated. Archie suffered like the rest, but he kept his spirits up with determination and humor. In one diary entry he joked, "If the bullets don't get us, the flies will eat us alive." Yet beneath the jokes was exhaustion and a growing awareness that survival was uncertain. Every day brought news of another mate shot by a sniper or struck down by sickness. The food was monotonous: hard biscuits known as Anzac wafers, tins of bully beef, and sometimes jam or tea if supplies got through. Water was precious, rationed carefully. Men went thirsty often, their lips cracked, their tongues swollen. Archie wrote longingly of fresh bread, cold milk, and the taste of fruit from home. Despite the horrors, there were moments of humanity. Archie often mentioned the bond of mateship, the unbreakable camaraderie among soldiers. When rations came in short, men shared without hesitation. When someone was wounded, others risked their lives to drag him to safety. Around small campfires at night, they sang Australian folk songs, told stories of home, and laughed to keep despair at bay. Archie found solace in writing. His diary became a lifeline, a way to pour out thoughts he could not say aloud. He described the strange beauty of the landscape, the blue sea below, the stars glittering overhead, the way dawn lit up the cliffs in crimson fire. "It is a terrible place," he admitted, "and yet it has moments that I will never forget." As the campaign dragged into its second month, battles flared with shocking intensity. In August 1915, the Allies launched a series of assaults to break the stalemate. Archie's battalion was thrown into the fight at Lone Pine, one of the bloodiest engagements of the Gallipoli campaign. The Australians charged into Turkish trenches, bayonets fixed, the air thick with smoke and dust. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal beyond words. Men stabbed, clubbed, and wrestled in the narrow trenches, slipping on blood-soaked earth. Archie wrote later, "It was like fighting in a slaughterhouse. You could not tell friend from foe in the chaos. The noise, the shouting, the cries of the wounded. It will haunt me forever. They held the trenches, but at a terrible cost. Thousands lay dead or wounded, the ground piled with bodies. Archie survived, but many of his mates did not. He listed their names in his diary, as though writing them down would keep them alive in memory." By late 1915, it was clear that Gallipoli was a disaster. Supplies were short, casualties enormous, and no progress had been made. The men were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and weary beyond belief. Yet they endured, driven by duty, mateship, and sheer stubbornness. Archie wrote of a strange moment one evening, a temporary truce to bury the dead. Australians and Turks climbed out of their trenches, meeting in the middle of no man's land. They dug shallow graves together, exchanged cigarettes, and even swapped souvenirs. For a brief time, enemies became men again, united by the shared horror of war. It was the queerest sight, Archie noted, to think that in an hour we would be killing each other again. The evacuation came as a surprise. In December, orders were given to withdraw quietly. The men could scarcely believe it. After all the blood, sweat, and death, they were to leave Gallipoli behind. Archie described the eerie silence of the final nights. Equipment muffled, footsteps careful, men slipping down to the beach in darkness. On December 20, 1915, Archie boarded a boat and looked back at the cliffs one last time. "It feels strange to leave it all behind," he wrote. "So many of our mates lie there still. We gave everything, and yet we are leaving as if it was all for nothing." For Archie and the Anzacs, Gallipoli was over. But the war was not. Ahead lay France and the Western Front, where the battlefields would be even larger, bloodier, and more terrifying. The Gallipoli campaign had ended in failure, but for Archie Barwick and his fellow Australians, the war was far from over. After a brief respite in Egypt, where they refitted, trained, and tried to regain some strength, the Australian imperial force was ordered to Europe. The men whispered about France and a place called the Somme, where the fighting was said to be worse than anything they had yet endured. Archie wrote in his diary as their transport ship carried them across the Mediterranean in early 1916. Gallipoli was bad enough. He confessed, "But everyone says the Western Front is a different matter altogether. Still, I am curious to see this France they speak of. It feels like we are part of something far bigger than before." When the Australians disembarked at Marseille, they were greeted not with gunfire, but with cheers. Crowds of French civilians lined the streets, waving flags and showering the soldiers with flowers. Women handed out fruit, children ran alongside the marching columns, and old men saluted. For a moment, Archie felt almost like a hero. It warmed the heart, he wrote, to be welcomed so kindly, though we knew that ahead lay only death and mud. From Marseille, the men traveled by train through the French countryside. Archie gazed out the window at rolling green fields, villages with church steeples, and farmers working their land. It seemed peaceful, almost untouched by war. But as the train rumbled north, the landscape began to change. Fields lay scarred with shell holes, forests reduced to splintered stumps, villages abandoned and crumbling. By the time they reached the front lines, Archie realized that France was no longer a country. It was a battlefield. The trenches of the Western Front were unlike anything at Gallipoli. They stretched for hundreds of miles, a vast network of ditches, dugouts, and barbed wire. Archie's battalion was assigned to a sector near Armentières, where they got their first taste of life in France. The cold was the first shock. In Gallipoli, the sun had been merciless, but in northern France, The winter chill cut through clothes and flesh alike. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of mud, sucking at boots and swallowing rifles. Men huddled in sodden greatcoats, their breath steaming in the icy air. Archie wrote, "It is a misery of a different kind, less about flies and heat, more about mud and cold that seeps into your bones." Then came the shell fire. At Gallipoli, artillery had been limited. Here it was relentless. Day and night, shells screamed overhead, shaking the earth, showering mud and shrapnel. Sometimes it was a barrage lasting hours, other times just a single shell that landed without warning. Archie admitted in his diary, "One never grows used to it. You hear the whine, then the crash, and you pray it does not land in your trench." The Australians soon learned the rhythm of trench life, long stretches of waiting punctuated by sudden bursts of terror. Archie spent hours on sentry duty, staring into no man's land through periscopes, watching for movement. He helped repair sandbags, carry supplies, and reinforce dugouts. The work was endless, the danger constant. Rats thrived in the trenches, feasting on scraps and corpses alike. Archie recorded one night when a rat scurried across his chest as he tried to sleep. "They are as big as kittens," he wrote, "and bold as brass. You can chase them, but they always come back." Yet even in the mud and misery, there were moments of cheer. The Australians earned a reputation among the British for their humor and irreverence. They sang bawdy songs, teased their officers, and improvised games to pass the time. Archie found comfort in writing letters home, though he admitted, "There are things I cannot put into words for my family. They would never believe half of it." In July 1916, orders came that the Australians were moving to the Somme. The British had launched a massive offensive there, and reinforcements were desperately needed. Archie and his mates boarded trucks, then marched through ruined villages toward the front. The closer they came, the more the land bore scars of battle. Craters, shattered trees, barbed wire twisted in heaps, and the constant thunder of guns. Archie described the approach vividly. "The whole earth seems alive with fire and smoke. The sky flashes red at night, and the air is filled with the roar of cannon. It is like walking toward the mouth of hell." On July 19, Archie's battalion was thrown into the fight at Fromelles. It was their baptism of fire on the Western Front, and it was catastrophic. The Australians charged across open ground, straight into machine gun fire. Men fell in rows, mown down like wheat before the scythe. The mud turned red with blood. Archie somehow survived, though he saw horrors he could scarcely describe. "It was slaughter," he wrote. "We went forward, but there was no cover, no chance. Men screamed, men prayed, men lay still in the mud. I have never seen such carnage. Gallipoli was nothing to this." In the days that followed, Archie helped recover the wounded from no man's land. The cries of the injured haunted him, men calling for water, for their mothers, for death to end their pain. Many could not be reached until nightfall, and by then it was often too late. Archie carried stretchers, bandaged wounds, and held the hands of dying mates. "We do what we can," he wrote, "but it is never enough." Despite the losses, the Australians proved themselves on the Somme. Their courage and determination won respect from the British commanders, though the men themselves cared little for praise. Archie summed it up simply, "We fight for each other, not for medals. It is the mates beside you who keep you going." By autumn, Archie had grown used to the life of the Western Front, though never comfortable. The endless mud, the lice, the cold, the shelling, it all wore men down, yet his diary remained remarkably hopeful. He often wrote of going home, of seeing his family again, of the farm life he had left behind. "It is that thought," he confessed, "that keeps me alive." By late 1916, the Somme offensive had ground to a halt, with hundreds of thousands dead on both sides and little to show for it. For Archie, the experience was seared into memory. "It is a waste beyond words," he wrote, "so much death, and yet the lines hardly move. But still, we carry on, because that is all we can do." The worst was yet to come, but Archie faced it with the same resilience that had carried him through Gallipoli. His diary remained a record of courage and survival. even as the world around him descended deeper into madness. By the winter of 1916, Archie Barwick had seen more death and destruction than most men could imagine in a lifetime. Gallipoli had been a brutal initiation, but the Somme was something else entirely. War on a scale so vast and mechanical that it seemed less like battle and more like the earth itself had gone mad. The Somme front stretched for miles, a wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and shattered trees. Villages had been reduced to rubble, church spires blasted into jagged stumps, and the once fertile fields were now craters filled with water and corpses. Archie recorded in his diary, "It is as if God has forsaken this place. The land is dead, and yet men fight over it as if it were treasure." The fighting was relentless. Shellfire thundered day and night, tearing the sky apart with flashes of light. Gas shells added another terror, filling the trenches with a choking green mist that burned the eyes and lungs. Archie and his mates wore crude gas masks, canvas hoods with glass eyepieces and filters of cotton soaked in chemicals. They worked, but barely. "The fear of gas is always with us," he wrote. "You never know when the cloud will drift your way." In September 1916, the Australians were thrown into the fighting at Pozières, a small village that became a symbol of sacrifice. For weeks, the men endured one of the heaviest bombardments of the war. "The shelling is beyond description," Archie noted. "The ground shakes like an earthquake and the noise deafens you. You cannot hear yourself think. Men go mad from it, running, screaming from the trenches, only to be cut down." Archie saw mates buried alive when dugouts collapsed, others torn apart by shells. He helped dig frantically with bare hands to rescue those trapped under earth and timber. Sometimes they succeeded, often they did not. "You get used to the sight of death," he confessed, "but you never get used to the sound of a mate calling for help and not being able to reach him." The Somme was not only death, but also endless mud. Rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire where men and horses drowned, where rifles clogged, and boots were sucked from feet. Archie described trudging for hours with his pack and rifle, only to collapse exhausted in a trench that offered no rest. Sleep was snatched in brief moments, often disturbed by shellfire or the scurry of rats. Rations were carried up through the muck, but often arrived spoiled or missing. Hard biscuits and tins of bully beef were the staple, washed down with tepid tea if they were lucky. Archie longed for the fresh food of home, writing, "I would give a month's pay for a loaf of bread and butter." Yet in the midst of all this, the spirit of the men endured. Archie often wrote of laughter in the trenches, of men joking even as shells exploded nearby. One night during a lull, a mate produced a mouth organ, and soon the whole trench was singing. It was the queerest thing, Archie recalled. The guns still boomed in the distance, but for a moment we were back home around a campfire, not in this wretched place. The casualties were staggering. In just 6 weeks at Pozières, the Australians lost over 23,000 men. Archie survived, though he was wounded more than once. A shell fragment grazed his arm. Another time, he was buried briefly by a collapse, but clawed his way out. Each brush with death left him shaken but more determined to keep going. "I sometimes wonder why I am spared," he wrote. "So many better men have gone. Perhaps it is luck, or perhaps it is so I can tell their story." In the autumn, Archie's battalion was rotated out of the line for rest. They billeted in barns and ruined villages, where for the first time in months they could wash, eat hot meals, and sleep in relative peace. Archie relished these moments, describing the simple joy of removing lice from his clothes, drinking fresh milk from a farmer's cow, and writing letters home by candlelight. "It is the small things that mean the most," he reflected. But the rest never lasted long. Soon they were marched back to the front, back to the endless roar of the guns. The Somme campaign dragged on into November, leaving the landscape a frozen, lifeless desert. When the fighting finally subsided, both sides were shattered. For Archie, the war was far from over. He would go on to fight in later battles, including Bullecourt, Ypres, and Passchendaele. He would be wounded, recover, and return again. Yet his diary remained steady. recording not only the horrors, but also the endurance of ordinary men caught in extraordinary times. One of his final entries during the Somme summed up the experience with stark clarity. "We have been through hell, and somehow we live. Gallipoli was bad, but the Somme is worse. Bigger, bloodier, more cruel. Still, we march on, we are soldiers, and that is what soldiers do. But I pray that one day, when this madness is over, people will remember what we gave here." Archie Barwick survived the war. He returned to Australia in 1919, carrying with him 4 years' worth of diaries, over 250,000 words, recording his journey from a farm boy in New South Wales to a seasoned veteran of Gallipoli and the Western Front. His writings are among the most detailed and moving accounts left by any Australian soldier of the Great War. For Archie, the diaries were not just a record but a lifeline. They gave him purpose, a way to endure, and later, a way to share the truth of what he and his mates had lived through. His words echo still, a voice from the trenches, honest and human, reminding us that behind every battle and statistic were men with hopes, fears, and the will to survive.